Hello. Um, Once again, you've joined us for Black Psychological Perspectives, a course at Oakwood University. Um, and I'm the instructor for the course at this time. And today we will be coming from Allison and Belgrave's book, Chapter 11 on Lifespan Development. So before I begin, I always like to start with a word of prayer. I'm just scooting back a little bit. Um, yeah, yeah. Dear Lord, thank you for another opportunity for us to discuss Black psychological perspectives, but more importantly, to begin to think about possibilities for life. Thank you for your continued blessings. Amen. All right, so with Allison and Belgrave's Lifespan Development, we'll discuss some vocabulary issues as we generally do, and we'll get into some of the other issues that the book brought out. I'm excited about this because it brought a range of things that I was introduced to, a long time ago, a little bit more than a couple of decades ago, in relation to how Black people relate to the world and how they connect to the world. So quite a bit of vocabulary to go through, and you can look up some of these things, but these are also given as vocabulary to prompt you to think about different things in different ways. As Paulo Freire says, or said, he has since passed, but in his book Pedagogy of the Oppressed, he talked about creating a deeper level of consciousness for people, and part of creating that deeper level of consciousness is vocabulary. I find that students and people who are not able to grasp newer concepts and understand newer ideas, they lack the vocabulary to do that. So let me get into this vocabulary here. Some of the words that we have here are maturation, right? And considering the process of maturation as well. Another term that we may use here is cohort, especially for those who are considering going to graduate school, but it's also a way to look at a research group as they move from one year to the next or move from one season to the next in a cohort. Demography, the process of and the study of demographics and looking at not just the actual statistics themselves, but how we put together demographics. Okay. Mortality, right? Mortality having to do with death rates, right? Another subset of demographics or demography. Poverty, which you're familiar with, but it's definitely one to take into consideration when we look at lifespan development. Martin Luther King talked about poverty being one of the most insidious forms of violence itself, right? Incarceration, right? And it has become more and more in the lexicon thanks to people like Ava DuVernay and reminding us, as well as Michelle Alexander, of the perniciousness of the 13th Amendment. And although, slavery ended legally overall, for a subgroup and a particular group who were incarcerated, it did not end, right? So incarceration. Next is suicide, right? And we should be aware that suicide has to do with the loss of meaning and hope, and it's usually a sociological phenomenon. In fact, our provost here studies the impact and the issues related to suicide, particularly for African Americans, also Afro-Caribbean people. Employment is another big thing to think about. And we compare that to entrepreneurship, but definitely employment is an important way to look at how people live life and how it impacts their development. Social cognitive theory, we should be familiar with as psychologists. SES, or social economic status. When that's put out there, a lot of times I think professors and graduate students may assume people know what they're talking about, but it's good to talk about what does socio-economic status mean, right? And those can be three very different things, but we sometimes lump them together, but it's good to break those down. Vygotsky, or Vygotskian, right? If we're talking about Vygotsky, and in particular his proximal zone of development and some of his ideas about child development, I think are important to be aware of. Especially as they're a departure from many of the ways of thinking in Western society and the ways that Americans typically like to think of child development. It just gives us another way to look at it, another lens. Phenomenological, right? If we're looking at ways in which things happen, it's important to understand that vocabulary word, phenomenological. I remember when my professor, Dr. Everton McIntosh, who I had a chance to see a couple weeks ago, he teaches across town at Alabama A&M, started using the word phenomena, and then he would differentiate it with phenomenon as it related to statistics. It was blowing my mind because I was like, what is he talking about? I don't even know what that is, other than I may have heard it in a song by Q-Tip. From a Tribe Called Quest, for those who aren't familiar with Q-Tip. Next vocabulary word, let me not get into my own hip-hop life. Ecological system, right? Being aware of an ecology, but also that there's a system to each ecology, right? Adolescence, right? And I like to think about it as adult being confused and essence being the time, but adolescence, right? Socialization, and that's a way to think about development as well. How people are socialized into understanding who they are and how they are to be in the world. Adulthood, as separate from childhood or boyhood or girlhood, right? And SCRD, Black Caucus of the Society for Research on Child Development. So the Society for Research on Child Development. It's a good resource for those who are doing research related to child development. And the last one, I usually give my own kind of vocabulary word I want people to consider, is overrepresented. Are students overrepresented in special education? Are they overrepresented in disciplinary infractions? Are they overrepresented when it comes to incarceration? These were vocabulary words of the book as addressing, maybe directly or indirectly, but these are things to consider. All right. After we've taken a look at some of these vocabulary words, you may want to pause and take a look at them yourself. We consider some of the things that the Centers for Disease Control in their analysis of behavioral risk factors and the surveillance system that's been developed that go along with the CDC. Black people ages 18 to 64 are at higher risk of early death than white people. Disparities in the leading causes of death for blacks compared to whites are pronounced by early to mid adulthood, such as these disparities are in issues related to homicide, chronic diseases such as heart disease or diabetes, right? Black people ages 18 to 34 years and 35 to 49 more years are 9 times and 5 times respectively more likely to die from homicide as white people the same age. And I'll just take a personal note. 2016, there were at least 3 black men who I remember who were my age in their early to mid 40s who were shot and killed, right? And watching that situation, brought home to me that, yeah, homicide is never far from me as a reality. Loss, death, to whether everything from gun violence to stabbing. Yeah. Black people ages 35 to 64 are 50% more likely to have high blood pressure than white people. High blood pressure, been taking meds since I turned 40, 41 to be precise, but I knew I had high blood pressure at 39, I just refused to do it. I tried to lose some weight and I did. I lost 20 pounds, still had high blood pressure, stress. Black people ages 18 to 49 years are 2 times as likely to die from heart disease than white people. Black people have the highest death rate for all cancers combined compared to white people. Now, this is coming from the Center for Disease Control, but it's a way to look at mortality as well as morbidity, right? Morbidity having to do with disease, right, and the rates at which disease occurs. Right. Some developmental theories that go along with these different ideas and some of the reasons or issues related to black people here in America. There's an attempt to understand physical development and impact of social contexts, right, with these developmental theories, right? Who are family, who are friends, who are church and community members, and how do these social context impact our development, right? So our emotions, our cognitions, and our social issues, they shape our lives. So the models and concepts and stages for development, mostly when we think about psychology, they come from Freud and Piaget and Erikson. But I did want to introduce you to some other people who have different models for development ideas. Everyone from Dowdy Azebo to Kobe Cambone to Dr. Lionel Mandy, who is a colleague of mine who is doing research now in Sri Lanka on the African presence in Sri Lanka, but also healers, natural and spiritual healers in Sri Lanka. Understanding like stage development, I think, is important, and we talked about that in some of our other talks. But how do we go from one stage to another? That's a thing to continually consider, and what are the forces that impact that? So if I can kind of give a bit of an example, or at least an idea, if my family dynamics and my friends and the community that I'm surrounded with, if they go through a disaster like a tornado or a hurricane, as happens where we're at here in the South, right? It may change the way in which people have conversations about life and death and how we understand our own development and our own life from moment to moment. Whereas if you don't live in that type of environment, especially if you don't live on an island compared to if you live in a landlocked state, you have a different understanding of life, death, and appreciation for nature. It's just different, but that can impact how you view the world. Also, if we look at development across different cohorts, whether it's the silent generation, the boomers, Gen X, the millennial generation, Generation Y, the I generation, as they have different terms, right? You could also begin to look at other conditions maybe for people in different countries, because the silent generation in America may be very different than the silent generation coming from Cambodia, right, after the Khmer Rouge, or the silent generation coming from Vietnam after the Vietnam War, or the silent generation coming after the 1950s and 60s, where all the revolutions were taking place throughout Africa, as well as in the Caribbean. Especially shout out to Jamaica, 1965 Independence Day, or shout out to Ghana, 1957 Independence year, right? So we're looking at 40 million Africans of America, as well as African descended immigrants, who are estimated to be about 1.5 to 2 million of that 40 million population in the USA, right? Sometimes, and I've heard people say this, like, I think we're being overrun by these Africans coming from the continent. No. Only 1 or 2 out of 40 is here from the African continent. Most of the black people you run into are black people from the Americas, and I'm including the Caribbean within that conversation, as well as South and Central America, right? And so thus they have a similar experience, right? That really kind of lops off maybe 200 to 300 years ago, and it's difficult to find out exactly who your family is, right? You have people who have a certain type of development that's different than a person who can trace back their family lineage indefinitely, or go back over hundreds of years, right? So, yeah, wow, the interesting stats, and I'm just I looked up some things on migration policy of Caribbean immigrants as well. In 2014, approximately 4 million immigrants from the Caribbean resided in the United States, accounting for 9% of the nation's 42.4 million immigrants. More than 90% of Caribbean immigrants came from 5 countries. These countries are Cuba, the Dominican Republic, Jamaica, Haiti, and Trinidad and Tobago. All right. Thinking about how Oakwood is itself. Oakwood is a institution that's in America, but many of the people who work here are either married to or are first or second generation immigrants from one of these Caribbean islands. Our fastest growing population right now are Latino students, and they're coming from mostly Cuba and the Dominican Republic. All right. Life expectancy is our next thing that we're looking here, and it's reminding me of a verse, Psalms 90:10. The days of your years are 70 and 10, and if by reason of strength they be fourscore years, yet is their strength labor and sorrow, for it is soon cut off, and we fly away. Just a reminder, you know, back then, a score was 20 years. If we're talking 70, that's 70 years. If we're talking fourscore years, it's saying, wow, you're lucky to be alive that long. People were thinking about it back in ancient times about how long we live, but I look at the life expectancy for African Americans, and particularly males versus female. I think about Sojourner Truth's conversation about Ain't I a Man Too, and about the labor and sorrow that she may talk about, but also the challenges that black men face in this country. So let me get into some of these pieces here. U.S. immigrants that come from predominantly black nations in Africa and South America are generally healthier than black immigrants from predominantly white nations or from Europe. Interesting. Maybe the diet, maybe the weather, maybe less stress, but there we go. However, African American boys, at least in the 2015 study, life expectancy was supposed to be about 72.2 years. And for a female, it is 78.5 years. So close to that 70 and 80 that we were talking about in Psalms 90, verse 10. Baby boomers are increasing the age of black people and other ethnic groups, right? They're living longer. They have more money. They have the most money of black people. And we've talked about this quite a bit. They hold the majority of black wealth. Baby boomers do. That boomer generation born in the very late 1940s to the early 60s, right? Baby boomers are a large part of that, increasing that age, but hold the wealth. African American population also tends to be younger than whites, nonetheless, right? We're not living as long. What are we losing by having fewer seniors or a younger population is something that I wonder from time to time, and especially when it comes down to passing down ideas, passing down wealth as well. Moving on to discussing childbirth. There was a higher percentage of black boys and men until the ages of 30 to 44 years of age. Then it switches, and then there are more women according to the 2010 census. This is new information. Black boys and men. There's more of them until the age of 30 to 44 years. Right? Could it be that incarceration and death may be impacting black boys and men, and then women's educational progress? It allows them to have better access to healthcare and other things. That's a possibility. If we look at places like Los Angeles, where 62% of the black, or the people who are on Skid Row and who are homeless in Los Angeles are black men, and that also these folks are more likely to die than the general population, we may have some answers there. Important broader studies to be done there to answer some of these questions. Fortunately, moving on to infant mortality rates, they have declined from 22.2 per 1,000 in 1980 to 14 per 1,000 in 2000, and now closer to 2013, 11.1 per 1,000. There's a higher rate of births of unmarried parents, and earlier timing of births has been of concern for the latest generation. However, we also have to look at and remember that black fathers and mothers both are more likely to be in their children's lives. Black fathers, more than any other group, are more likely to be in their child's life. Divorce rates have shot up. Most states have 50%, sometimes even as high as 60 or 70% divorce rates. So the idea that black fathers are absent isn't quite true. African American fathers are found to be the most engaged if they are able. Again, if they're not incarcerated, and even if they are, I have a good colleague who, she was one of our students, master's students, won master's thesis of the year at Cal State Long Beach about 5 years ago. Her name is Patrice Collins. She's now studying at Yale University, but she studied fathers who were incarcerated and their efforts to parent and connect with their children. So even if we have this image and idea of the absentee black father, the statistics prove that wrong. Another broad and very pressing concern is that black mothers' pregnancy-related deaths have increased since 1987 from 7.2 per 100,000 live births to 17.3 in 2013 in 100,000 live births. That's more than double the amount of black mothers dying in a pregnancy-related incident. African American mothers may be under greater stress, and they may be less likely to breastfeed due to low socioeconomic factors, and at higher risk for postpartum depression. We know that poverty can play a huge factor, but also stress of striving for the next status, the next level of economic security, as well as social comfort or expectation. All these factors can play into the challenges that mothers that mothers face, I should say. All right, adolescence. African American girls show earlier signs of physical development compared to their peers, according to the research here. African American youth in general show earlier marks of maturation. And we pose a question here: could it be the chemicals in the food? Could it be, I'm particularly talking about processed foods, right? Obesity has grown as a developmental concern in the last 20 years. Thus, we had Michelle Obama doing her efforts related to reducing obesity, right? And some in government wanted to fight an important effort, but I'm hoping that will continue, at least for this next generation, and that will stay in their mind. Summer vacation or lack thereof may be to blame, sedentary lifestyle, and especially if you don't have money to pay for summer camp, and if your city's no longer offering a free summer activity, well, then students and young people are sitting at home playing video games or doing nothing at all, watching whatever, and not going out and exercising. There's an increased importance of peer input when it comes to health and other issues. However, African American students also need adult input. Males seem to benefit even more from mentors, and those who had mentors demonstrated less sexual activity and less, more engagement in school, right? Hey, moving on to adulthood. Early development may lead to earlier adult role expectations for women, right? If people look around and they expect these young girls to grow up fast, right? And I don't know if anyone's ever heard this phrase, but mothers love their sons and raise their daughters, right? And this goes to some of the expectations that mothers may have of their daughters and very little expectations that they may have for their sons. That's a phrase, may not necessarily bear out to be true in every home, but it can happen. And some of these ideas or phrases are based in some semblance of reality. Male role development also has strong inertia in the USA and how males see themselves in their role expectations. Gooden identified the street corner society and talked about that having a lack of support for young men from older males as mentors led to greater challenges. This lack of education and employment put older men in a situation with less of an opportunity to mentor or feeling like they had anything to contribute. And I'd even read some other folks such as Anderson who talked about street culture versus home culture or school related type culture, and how when people feel pushed out of or pushed into one or the other culture, it's difficult for them to switch in between. It's the rare person, particularly a rare man, who could switch in between those. For men, fear of intimacy, challenges with extramarital affairs, and an inability to handle conflicts within relationships often block them from developing mentoring relationships or other relationships that would sustain them and help them to rise rather than stagnate or struggle. Perry and Lewis interviewed 25 African American fathers and found that they desired to be a role model. They wanted to raise and take care of their children financially. They provided their children with lessons on how to live a good life, and they wanted to provide emotional support for their children. So there's evidence clearly that black fathers want to be engaged, want to be involved, and more studies of this type need to be done, but they're out there. Older adulthood. 11.9% of African American men the age of 74 were employed, and 20% volunteered. So, some folks aren't able to retire. I don't fear this, but I'm coming to accept that I may be in that group where I may never retire. I may still need to continue working. Some of that is just inertia of living a life where I always worked. And I think the other piece is too the reality of not having enough money. So grandparents may also act as the primary caregivers, and I know several folks who I work with who are the primary caregivers as grandparents. And they may be boomers or in the early part of Gen X, and they have some level of financial stability where they're able to take care of the rest of the family. Everyday stressors of a functional disability or transportation, social conflicts with even same-age peers, lack of respect, whether that's real or perceived, and grudges can also wear on folks in older adulthood. I was talking with someone earlier today about board meetings and church board meetings where sometimes people feel that this is the only place where I'm being heard, and they really want that aspect in their lives where they were respected and heard, and sometimes church is the only place where an older African American person can get that respect. African Americans living in the North had lower levels of psychological stress than those living in the South. And the only kind of conception I had of that, or hypothesis I have on that, is that perhaps there's either more said or more directly done to fight issues in the North, right? And it may be a perception, right? But that perception becomes a reality on the body when you have this psychological stress. I would also say that some of our elders' wisdom and legacy is being lost, and that's constant, ongoing with time, but I think we had a very particular time when it came to the boomer generation where they were fighting for change, and that group is now passing away. They're in their 60s, 70s, or 80s, and we need to really catalog what they know and how they survived such horrendous times when it was legal to segregate, legal to discriminate, legal to engage in extrajudicial killings, right? Better term, lynching, right? We need to understand what it meant to live and thrive during that time. That's not just for black people. That's for the ages. That's for everyone to understand. How did these people do that? Don't get me started on how much I think black people are awesome. All right. Some other issues, right? Poverty, early death, incarceration, suicide, and some issues with seniors. Some other numbers to consider. The national poverty rate is 13.5%, and the African American poverty rate is 24.1%. Nearly a quarter of black people live in poverty. 36% of African American children live in poverty. Black children in rural or non-metropolitan areas have higher rates of poverty. 46.7%, while urban areas it is 35%. Right? That's why people are always looking to move from the country to the city. It's just a common conversation, but when you have hardly anything, a little bit of nothing is better than anything. Right? Current death rates from black children have decreased from 2005 to 2015. So the death rate was 42 per 100,000. Now it's 36 per 100,000. Black boys 12 to 19 years old, the death rate is 94.1 per 100,000. Males 14 to 19, the leading causes of death are homicide at 48.6%, unintentional injuries at 24.1%, and suicide at 7.1%. So these top three leading causes of death for black males 14 to 19: homicide, unintentional injuries, and suicide. Wow. African American males are 34.7% of inmates, while whites are 58.7%. Black males are well overrepresented when it comes to the prison industrial complex. There's many different reasons why, but it's worth it to know and understand. 1 out of 3. African American males, who were 9% of the 55 to 70-year-olds, could be 14% by 2050. Right? That's going to be a rapid increase. I pray so. I pray that we're living longer. I pray that we're in better socioeconomic conditions. It's hard hearing all those, right? And so I didn't want to take a pause for the cause on black resilience. These data sets represent the toxicity of American life. So we have to remember to take precautions when we work with it. We have to remember who we are and whose we are and what we have overcome in spite of. For those of us who believe in God, God makes a way out of no way. If you follow the Ghanaian phrase, Giname, without God, and this is what it means, without God I would not have made it, nor can I make it. How I got over is another phrase I love to hear, right? Another one I think that is important, especially for researchers, we have to measure our own success. We have to take a look at what we're getting right. I'm going to make a plug here for Ivory Tolson's book, No BS, or No Bad Stats on Black People, right? I encourage us to find things that are right with black people, as well as to know what the current statistics say, and then how we can begin to measure us moving up from that or continuing what we're doing right. Don't wait to be validated by someone else's standards as well. I think this is extremely important, right? We have to create our own resilience, and we have to document that as well and share that with others. So I'm just pausing here because the book did talk about Vygotsky as well. Well, I guess I'm back from the pause or the commercial break there on black resilience, because it's hard to hear all those numbers and not want to seek and reach out for some resilience. So now to Vygotsky, Bronfenbrenner, and ecology, this old school psychologist, these are kind of core pieces of how I do psychology, as it were. So for Vygotsky, his departure from people like Watson and Skinner was that he talks about culture not only shaping the content of a child's cognitions, the what that they know, but also shapes the process of the how or their cognition, right? Culture supports the content of our learning and cognitions. If we think hip hop, rap, jazz, these are all ways in which to convey ideas, right? And as well to convey what is important and how it is important to us. If you just look at John Coltrane's work, and if you wanted to understand black ways of being in the world, Coltrane would give it to you. But there's so many more. Dizzy Gillespie, Miles Davis, Alice Coltrane. So many more who can give you that understanding of how culture can shape our lives. Right, from African American children, relationships, verve, rhythm, movement, kinesthetic movements as well, and touch. Also oral, verbal, and auditory modes of interacting with people are important. And Vygotsky was talking about this when many of the other more Western viewpoints were not. And Vygotsky is a Russian, and so there was a period where no one wanted to talk about Russians, but when I got to graduate school, many of my professors were finally able to speak about him, but my professors were taught in the 60s and 70s. And they were finally to learn more and write more books about him. So the Vygotskian kind of path is very important for us as we think about culture and development. Bronfenbrenner in ecology, he talked about development is shaped by the interaction between the person and the context within those environments that the person may be developing, and the types of exchanges that take place, right? Micro, meso, and macro systems. And I'm just giving you a brief review of Bronfenbrenner, right? And there's some more related to some of these pieces of development in general and ecology, understanding processes and outcomes linked to any specific phenomena that are shaped by the meaning of individuals make, as well as the developmental, social, and cultural contextual influences. If I go back to the conversation we had about suicide, and if I look at Durkheim and how society can be structured and changed, it helps me to better understand some of the challenges that Black youth face right now. We're seeing on social media, but as well, we're looking at the statistics. Most importantly, we're looking at both. Right, we can be prompted to go back to look at our demographics and the rash or the ongoing challenges with young Black people who are committing suicide. Right, some as young as 10 years old, 8 years old, or we just lost a young man here in Huntsville because he was bullied for being gay, but also, this led to his depression. Right, and the challenges dealing with depression, and his mother misses him deeply. We just lost him this week, right? But this context that he's living in, this time that he's living in, and the types of things that are being said, and he's not being nurtured, we have to find ways and environments in order to do that. All right. Black psychology and development. I mentioned a few more of these great authors, but I'm going to remind you about Lionel Mandy, and he has the I Am model of African American male development. Linda James Myers talks about an optimal psychology, and she talks about development within that optimal psychology. Wade Nobles has brought together the ancient wisdom from Africa, and to talk about seeking the saku, or seeking the soul, and understanding that better. William Cross's, of course, Black identity development, but I also like to remember Dr. Fukiao, who I had the chance to meet a couple of times at the Association of Black Psychologists Convention. I bring him up because he has since passed, but he is left us with so many outstanding thoughts in his two books that I'm going to share with you. First is Kandizi, The Congo Art of Babysitting, and the other book is African Cosmology of the Bantu Congo, Tying the Spiritual, Not Principles of Life and Living. Both of these books give everyone in the world, but particularly African Americans, a tie back to who we are as people in our life and our development. I just want you to know that these books are out there, that you're not having to discover all this alone, that people from the African continent are more than happy to share who they are and who we are in the world. It's as if we've grown up without a mother or without a father, and we're learning again, but we have that opportunity now. So let's take advantage of that. Right, so some interventions, and I love that the book chapters always end with interventions or ideas, right? Churches who present holistic view of mental health and wellness for youth to seniors are important. Youth programs such as the YMCA, Boys and Girls Club, fraternity and sorority programs, junior ROTC, after school programs. These are important to consider when it comes to youth development, but students who are involved in these clubs are more likely to finish high school and or go on to college. Again, sports are another way, and particularly for girls, if we think about Title IX and young women who participate in sports, they're less likely to be sexually active and have a child before they're 18. They'll have their child after 18, just to be clear. So recreational and outdoor sports, or even indoor sports like chess, camping, scouting, or pathfinders, right? Other interventions are rites of passages programs with emphasis on African or Black or American ancestry. Cultural specific programs, Afro-Caribbean, Ghanaian, Nigerian, Ethiopian, Eritrean, and I can go on. And remember, when conducting research, that context of the population is everything. For example, sometimes people of higher socioeconomic status are more likely to respond to your survey. And this is what I've found. But be aware of the lack of generalization, right? I can't really say this applies to all Black people. I can only say it applies to this particular socioeconomic status. So it's important to have a range of understanding when it comes to socioeconomic status when you do your research. Right. Some questions that we have as we're ending, and you may want to consider as well. How do you feel when talking about statistics of mortality, right? Mortality being death, or morbidity being disease. What are things to look out for with your children, right? And many of my college students, and like myself, within 5 years of being a college student, I was a parent. So many of you who are taking this course may already be parents, or maybe on your way to being a parent, What are things you're looking out for your children when it comes to their development? How consciously are you considering that? What concerns you about your parents? What did your parents do right, perhaps, but also what did they do wrong and that you'd like to improve upon? Right? Time is constantly flowing, right? How can we make things better for the next generation? And this last piece, how can we take better care of our parents, right? As the fifth commandment admonishes us to do, honor our mother and our father so that our days may be long upon the land. Right. Well, that's it. I'll end there. Thank you for watching thus far. I guess I'm processing all kinds of configurations here in my computer, telling me it's time to go. Hope you have a blessed day. Bye.